His teacher had never called on him before, not once. But the day she finally did, it wasn't to give him a chance. It was to humiliate him in front of everyone. What she didn't expect was what happened next. When he started playing, the look on her face said it all. She never saw it coming. Jordan Hayes sat by the window, his pencil tapping lightly against his notebook. It wasn't nerves, just a habitone his mother always told him to break. But for him, it helped him think. The classroom at Oak Ridge Middle School in Fairview, Georgia, buzzed with the usual noise before the lesson began. But Jordan wasn't paying attention to the chatter around him. His focus stayed on the worksheet in front of him. He liked finishing things early. At the front of the room, Mrs. Diane Calloway flipped through her notes, her sharp eyes scanning the pages. She had been teaching 6th grade for nearly 15 years, long enough to build a reputation. Strict but fair, that's what most students said. At least the ones she liked. Jordan had never been one of them. She never made it obvious. She never raised her voice or said anything cruel. But she rarely called on him when his hand was up. When he got an answer right, she moved on quickly. If he got one wrong, which was rare, she paused, as if savoring the moment. Jordan noticed. So did a few of his classmates. "Yo, she barely even looks at you, Marcus Evans," the boy sitting next to him whispered one afternoon. "You got, like, teacher invisibility or something?" Jordan had only shrugged. "Guess I do." But today something was different. Mrs. Calloway was watching him more than usual, not in a way that meant trouble, but in a way that felt expectant. The lesson began. A standard history discussion, something about the Civil War. Jordan took notes, waiting for the usual routine to play out. Then something unexpected happened. "Jordan," Mrs. Calloway said suddenly, her voice crisp, "why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned. Jordan blinked. She never called on him. He straightened in his seat, scanning the board. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military campaign aimed at destroying the Confederacy's resources and morale. A pause. Mrs. Calloway hummed. Not bad. Not bad at all. It was a textbook perfect answer. But something about the way she responded made a few students exchange glances. Marcus shot Jordan a look that said, "What was that about?" The lesson continued, but the shift had been made. She wasn't ignoring him anymore. She was watching. And then, just before the bell rang, she made her move. "Jordan," she said, as students began packing up, "stay behind for a moment." A few heads turned again, but no one said anything. Jordan took his time putting away his notebook before walking toward her desk. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said, clasping her hands together. "About your grandfather." Jordan frowned. "What about him? You said he was a musician." Something in her tone made the air feel heavier. He nodded. "Yeah. He was a pianist. Played jazz." Mrs. Calloway's lips curled slightly, not quite a smirk, but something close. Interesting. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. "You must have picked up a thing or two." Jordan didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure where this was going, but it didn't feel right. "A little," he admitted. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Good to know." The bell rang. Jordan grabbed his bag and turned toward the door, but her voice stopped him. "Tomorrow," she said. "Let's see what you've got." He turned back. "What?" She gestured toward the old upright piano in the corner, the one collecting dust at the back of the room. "You'll play something for the class." Jordan stared at her. A few remaining students near the doorway paused, eyes flicking between them. "Why?" Mrs. Calloway tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the question. "Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you." Jordan recognized that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup, but he wasn't about to back down. That night, Jordan barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the conversation replaying over and over in his mind. This wasn't a request. It was a challenge, and he knew exactly what kind. She expected him to stumble, to embarrass himself, to reinforce whatever opinion she already had of him. But she didn't know the full story. The next morning, when Jordan walked into class, he felt it immediately, the weight of something unspoken. Word had traveled fast. Whispers followed him as he took his seat. Tomorrow had arrived, and he was ready. "You really gonna play today?" Lucas Carter, one of the loudest kids in class, smirked from across the room. Jordan didn't answer. "Didn't know you were a piano guy," Marcus Evans murmured beside him. Jordan kept his eyes on his notebook. "There's a lot of things people don't know." The classroom door swung open, and Mrs. Calloway strode in, setting her books down with deliberate ease. She barely acknowledged the students as they settled in, her focus drifting toward Jordan before she even began the lesson. The first half of class dragged, but Jordan barely heard any of it. His mind kept skipping ahead, counting down to the inevitable moment. And then it came. "Well," Mrs. Calloway said, snapping her book shut and glancing at the clock, "we have a little time before the next lesson." Perfect. She turned toward the old upright piano at the back of the room. "Jordan, let's see what you can do." The air shifted. Students straightened in their seats. Some whispered. Others just watched. Jordan stayed still for a moment, feeling every eye on him. His heartbeat was steady, not fast, just strong. Then he stood. A few muffled laughs rippled through the room as he walked toward the piano. Someone muttered something under their breath, just low enough that he couldn't make out the words. But he didn't need to. He already knew the tone. Mrs. Calloway clasped her hands together. "Play whatever you'd like." Jordan studied the piano. The keys were yellowed with age, a few chipped at the edges. He let his fingers drift over them, barely touching. The instrument was out of tune, not by much, but enough. He inhaled, sat down, let his hands rest on the keys. He knew exactly what he was going to play. Then, behind him, he heard it. A laugh. Quiet. A snicker. This wasn't just about proving Mrs. Calloway wrong anymore. It was about proving everyone wrong. And he was going to do it in a way they would never forget. The room had never been this quiet. Even Mrs. Calloway, who always carried herself with unwavering certainty, had an almost curious look in her eyes. Some students expected a disaster. Others were just here for the show. Jordan placed his fingers on the keys. They felt familiar beneath his touch, even though this piano was nothing like the one at home. His grandfather's piano had been warm, well-loved. Its deep, rich tones filled a room effortlessly. This one, the keys were stiff, the soundboard likely warped from years of neglect. A deep breath, a moment of stillness. Then he played. The first few notes floated through the air, soft and steady. A blues progression, the kind his grandfather had played for hours on humid Georgia afternoons. Jordan's fingers moved with confidence, rolling through the chords. His left hand kept the rhythm while his right danced over the melody. The room changed. The whispers stopped. Even the kids who had been smirking a moment ago sat frozen. Mrs. Calloway crossed her arms, her brows furrowing slightly. She had expected hesitation, maybe a shaky start. Instead, she was hearing something she hadn't prepared for. But Jordan wasn't playing for them. He was playing for himself, for his grandfather. He let himself sink into the music, feeling each note as if it were telling a story only he understood. His fingers glided effortlessly across the keys, striking a balance between precision and a raw emotion. It wasn't just technical skill. It was a conversation. Him and the keys. And then he took a risk. He shifted into something more intricate, letting his hands weave complex runs up and down the keyboard. Progression his grandfather had taught him. One he had struggled with for months before finally mastering. A deep, rolling bass line pulsed beneath a soaring melody, notes colliding and resolving in perfect harmony. The longer he played, the heavier the silence became. It wrapped around the room. No one laughed now. Marcus, sitting near the front, leaned forward slightly, his eyes wide. Lucas, who had cracked a joke earlier, sat with his arms crossed, but he wasn't smirking anymore. A few students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. Not just shock, something closer to admiration. And then, the crescendo. Jordan's fingers pressed firmly against the keys, striking chords that echoed against the walls. The music swelled, filling every inch of the room, every quiet space where doubt had once lived. He pushed harder, letting the final run carry the weight of everything he hadn't said. And then silence. The last note hung in the air. A moment passed, then another. Jordan lifted his hands, resting them on his lap. No one moved, no one spoke. Then a single clap from the back of the room, then another and another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Marcus let out a low whistle. Damn. Lucas, still sitting with his arms crossed, gave a small shake of his head. Didn't know he could do that. Jordan exhaled, not from nerves, from the sheer energy of what had just happened. Because he had done more than play. He had changed something, and there was no going back. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room, every quiet space where doubt had once lived. Jordan pushed harder, letting the final run carry the weight of everything he hadn't said. And then silence. The last note lingered in the air, stretching the moment as if refusing to fade. Jordan lifted his hands, resting them in his lap. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then a single clap. It came from the back of the room. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Marcus let out a low whistle. Damn. Lucas, still sitting with his arms crossed, gave a small shake of his head. I didn't know he could do that. Jordan exhaled not from nerves, but from the sheer energy of the moment. Because he had done more than play. He had changed something. The applause swelled. Students exchanged glances, as if they had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, something they would remember. But the loudest silence of all came from Mrs. Calloway. Her expression was unreadable. She stood by her desk, arms still crossed, lips pressed tightly together. The applause carried on around her, but she didn't move. She didn't say a word. Jordan stayed still, his hands resting in his lap. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't looking for approval. He just let the moment stretch, letting them all sit with what had just happened. Then finally, Mrs. Calloway spoke. Well, she said, her voice clipped, that was unexpected. The clapping died down. Students glanced between her and Jordan. A few whispered excitedly, but the energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. Where did you learn to play like that? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Jordan met her gaze, unflinching. My grandfather. Something flickered across her face, but it was gone too fast to name. She straightened. I see. A pause. Mrs. Calloway tapped her fingers against the desk, the only sound in the now silent classroom. Then she turned back to the students, her posture stiff. All right, let's get back to our lesson. But nobody moved. Jordan glanced around. Marcus was still watching him, eyebrows raised like he couldn't believe what he had just seen. In the back, Olivia Brooks looked almost annoyed, like the moment had been taken from them too soon. Lucas scoffed under his breath. That's it? Mrs. Calloway's eyes snapped to him. Excuse me? Lucas shrugged, shifting in his chair. I mean, that's all you're going to say? He gestured vaguely. He just played like something out of a movie. And you're just gonna move on? A few heads nodded in agreement. Mrs. Calloway's mouth tightened. This is a classroom, not a talent show. Jordan took a slow breath, steadying himself. You didn't think I could play, did you? Her eyes darted back to him sharp, assessing. He didn't let her look away. That's why you called me up here. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Mrs. Calloway exhaled slowly. I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent with the class. Jordan shook his head. No, you didn't. His voice was calm. Even. You thought I'd mess up. That's why you asked. More whispers. Mrs. Calloway's fingers curled slightly against the edge of her desk. That's enough, Jordan. But he wasn't done. You wouldn't have asked Marcus, he continued, glancing at his friend, or Olivia, or Lucas, but you asked me. The room was holding its breath. Mrs. Calloway's jaw tightened. You're out of line. Jordan held her gaze. I don't think I am. Her eyes darkened. Her posture stiffened. Sit down. For the first time all year, Jordan didn't immediately obey. He looked around the room, at his classmates, at the ones who had ignored him before, at the ones who had underestimated him, at the ones who had smirked when she called his name. Then slowly he stood. The silence felt heavier now, charged, and Mrs. Calloway, for all her usual control, looked just a little bit shaken. But this time, she wasn't the one in charge of the room. Jordan walked back to his seat, each step deliberate, feeling the weight of every eye on him. His heart wasn't pounding anymore. He wasn't nervous. If anything, a strange sense of calm had settled over him. He lowered himself into his chair, still feeling the stares. Marcus gave him a slow nod, one that didn't need words. Olivia was still watching Mrs. Calloway, arms crossed, like she was waiting for something more. But Mrs. Calloway had turned away. She flipped open her lesson plan, eyes fixed on the page, as if she could pretend nothing had happened. Let's move on. The room didn't shift back to normal as quickly as she expected. The energy lingered. People still whispered. It wasn't just about the music anymore. Lucas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Kinda weird how you don't want to talk about it. Mrs. Calloway's eyes snapped up. Excuse me? Lucas shrugged. You made a big deal about him playing. The unspoken words hung in the air. But now you're acting like it never happened. A few quiet murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Mrs. Calloway's grip on her book tightened. That's enough. But it wasn't. The hesitation, the discomfort. Jordan had seen it, and so had everyone else. For the rest of the class, Mrs. Calloway still held control, but something had shifted. Her authority felt thinner, like a pane of glass that had just been cracked. She still led the lesson. She still called on the same students. But the usual rhythm was gone. The energy in the room was different. When the bell finally rang, chairs scraped against the floor as students packed their things, still murmuring to each other as they filed out. Jordan slung his bag over his shoulder, heading toward the door. But just before he stepped out, he turned back. For a second, Mrs. Calloway looked like she might say something real, something that mattered, but instead, her expression hardened. I hope you understand that this is still my classroom. Jordan studied her. Then, in the same calm, steady voice he had used before, he said, I know. A beat of silence passed between them. Then he walked out. Bro, what was that? Marcus caught up to him in the hallway, shaking his head with a grin. You just flipped everything upside down. Jordan let out a breath. Yeah. Marcus nudged his shoulder. So, You gonna play again?" Jordan thought about it. About the feeling of the keys beneath his fingers. About the way the music had filled the room. He smiled. "Yeah, I think I will." Because today, he hadn't just played music. He had been heard. The sun hung low over Oakview Drive as Jordan walked home, long shadows stretching across the pavement. The weight he had been carrying, the tension, the doubt, was gone. At the corner store near his neighborhood, he stopped to grab a bottle of water. Mr. Reynolds, the shop owner, leaned against the counter, watching him with a knowing look. "You look like a kid who just did something important." Jordan hesitated, then smiled. Maybe I did. By the time he reached home, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread filled the air. His mother stood at the stove, humming softly as she flipped a fillet. "You're home late." Jordan dropped his bag by the door and sat at the kitchen table. "Had a long day." His mother glanced over her shoulder. Good or bad? He thought about it, the way the room had fallen silent, the way Mrs. Calloway had looked at him, the way his classmates had truly seen him for the first time. "Good," he said finally. "Really good." She turned off the burner, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and sat across from him. "You want to talk about it?" Jordan nodded. For the next 15 minutes, he told her everything. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush him. She just listened. Her expression shifted. Concern, pride, and something else. Something softer. Almost sad. When he finished, she exhaled. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." Jordan smirked slightly. "I think I did." She studied him for a moment. "And how do you feel about that?" He didn't have to think long. Like it was supposed to happen. His mother smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Good. The next day at school, things weren't drastically different. Mrs. Calloway still ran her class the same way. She still called on the same students. She still acted like nothing had changed. But the energy in the room had shifted. People saw her differently now. And they saw Jordan differently, too. During lunch, a few students, ones who had never spoken to him before, stopped by his table. "Dude, you were insane on that piano," Olivia Brooks said, sitting across from him. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 5. Marcus shook his head. "Man, you've been holding out on us." Jordan smirked. "Guess so." Across the cafeteria, Mrs. Calloway walked past, tray in hand. Their eyes met briefly. This time she looked away first. And Jordan? He just kept eating, because he had already said everything he needed to say. Some lessons aren't taught in books. Some moments change the way people see the world, whether they want to or not. Mrs. Calloway had spent the year looking past him, and in just a few minutes he had made sure she would never do it again. Maybe she would never say it out loud. Maybe she would never admit what she had done, what she had assumed. But it didn't matter, because now Jordan knew something that she didn't. When people try to silence you, when they try to underestimate you, the best thing you can do is let your talent speak louder than their doubts. And when you do, they'll have no choice but to listen.